Less than 2 years ago, there was almost 50,000 available ball pythons on Morph Market. But as of July 2025, that number has been cut in almost half. So this leads us to some obvious questions. The first one is, what exactly caused this great drawdown in available ball pythons on Morph Market? The second one is this a good or a bad thing for our hobby? And lastly, what does it mean about the future of the ball python breeding industry? Anyways, my name's Steven with Leviathan, and let's get to it. Before we can get into the causes of the ball python drawdown, we have to understand how exactly we got to 50,000 ball pythons on Morph Market to begin with. So, going back to about 2019-2020 timeframe, COVID was just kicking off in the world, and as this was happening, there was a lot of uncertainty. So the people who were breeding ball pythons at the time pared back their pairings because they didn't know what was going to happen during COVID. They didn't know if they were going to be able to have shows because so many different shows had gotten canceled. They didn't know if they were going to be able to ship because FedEx had gotten shut down at the first part of COVID. So with this uncertainty, they didn't produce as many animals as they had in previous years. In addition, a large portion of the population was working from home for the very first time in their adult lives, and this allowed them to have more time to scroll on social media and connect with content that was related to reptiles and helped spark their interest in these animals. And lastly, there was a lot of people who were dissatisfied with their jobs and wanted to leave them, causing the Great Resignation at the time. And I think that with some of these people, they viewed that the animals were a way to get out of a job that they didn't want to do anymore. For a few months, the entire world was locked down from COVID, but slowly regulations started loosening and reptile shows were able to come back. But when they did come back, there were a couple different changes, one being time slots rather than a ticket that got you in for the entire weekend. So what happened was, as reptile shows came back, everybody who was already in the hobby at that point in time wanted to go to these shows because they had been gone for the last few months. In addition, all of the people who had gotten interested in the reptile hobby during the lockdown wanted to go out and experience reptile shows in person because it was something they'd heard about but hadn't been able to do yet. So this created great turnouts at these reptile shows where even local shows had lines out the door and into the parking lot. But when the people were able to get inside the show, they didn't have all weekend to look at the animals and make their purchasing decisions. Instead, they had maybe 2 hours tops. So what would happen is they would immediately go in, they would start searching for the animals that they wanted, and they were immediately making purchasing decisions. So all of this combined to create a situation where everybody knew that if there was an animal that you were interested in, you could not wait around for it, because if you waited, somebody else was going to see it and they were going to buy it first and you would miss out. So all of these different factors resulted in a situation where ball pythons were selling so incredibly fast that the limited supply could not keep up with the demand. Subsequently, prices started increasing for pretty much every single morph and every single project across the board. New social media influencers started popping off, gaining traction, and drew even more eyes to the ball python world. And there were animals that were selling for such huge prices that attracted the interest of business-minded people who thought that ball pythons were an insane way to make a return because all you had to do was buy these snakes, put them together, and then you'd have an entire clutch worth thousands and thousands of dollars per animal. So with a massive increase in demand and the supply that wasn't able to keep up with it, the people who were established in the hobby already decided that they were going to drastically increase production and that they were going to breed every single animal that they had, because it didn't matter what it was, as long as they were producing an egg, they knew that that animal was going to sell. But the problem with this is once you decide that you are going to increase production, it still takes about 9 months to a year before you actually see those new babies. So even though the demand was sky high in 2021 and 2022, when the massive increase in production came, it wasn't until 2023. The problem with this, though, is that by 2023, all of the COVID breeders who got in 2020 and 2021, they were no longer buying animals like they had been in the previous years. The vast majority of the hatchlings that they originally bought were now up to size and they were pairing them themselves. So this meant that they weren't going to have as much space available because they knew that they needed to have enclosures for the upcoming hatchlings. In addition, all of these people had spent a ton of money already, and oftentimes they didn't have excess savings and they didn't have excess lines of credit that they could keep buying animals in, especially when they already had bought tons of animals in the last few years. And lastly, inflation had been running rampant since 2020, 2021, and 2022. So what this resulted in was the discretionary income that they had previously had wasn't the same because everything in their lives was more expensive, so they didn't have as much money coming in from the regular paychecks that they could invest into ball pythons. So with a wave of production hitting the market in 2023 from the established breeders who had increased production and the COVID breeders who were now just getting their first hatchlings, but a drastic decrease in demand because the market force of the COVID breeders was no longer there in order to buy this increased supply, the available animals on morph market started growing and growing and growing because they were no longer flying off the shelves like they had been during 2020, 2021, and 2022. With all of these factors, the animals started piling up on morph market, and as the number grew and grew and grew and it took longer and longer to sell, oftentimes a breeder would try to undercut everybody else on the market in order to be the first person to sell their snake, even if they were getting less than what they perceived as the full retail value. As others noticed that this seemed to be the best way to actually move their animals, everybody started undercutting each other. And this resulted in a situation where prices during 2023 went from the COVID highs crashing down to 50 or 75% less than what they had been a year before. Oftentimes, the COVID crash is blamed on the COVID breeders, and I don't think that this is accurate. While there definitely were COVID breeders who undercut the market in order to sell their animals, I think that for everybody in the hobby, if they saw a brand new breeder posting an animal for less than the market price, it was understood that they didn't have the brand to justify the higher price with the rest of the market. Instead, the COVID crash came when established breeders started undercutting the rest of the market. So when established breeders took an animal that was, let's say, $2,500 and they marked it down to $1,500, all of the new breeders saw that the established breeder was only charging $1,500 and they knew that they didn't have a strong enough brand in order to compete with them, especially if they were pricing their animals at $2,500. So therefore they had to drop their prices to even have a hope of selling their animal. That said, these massive price crashes definitely caused a panic, and a lot of the COVID breeders who hadn't been through a market cycle like this before only knew that they had spent top dollar for all of the animals that they had previously bought a year or 2 years ago, and now those exact same animals were worth a fraction of what they were. And this resulted in a lot of the COVID breeders feeling like that they had gotten scammed and burned by the entire hobby, and that the animals were never worth those prices to begin with, and instead they had been taken advantage of. So these people decided to get out of the breeding world entirely, and they dumped their collections for pennies on the dollar. And when these animals started hitting the market, not only did it further exacerbate the problems with the price crashes, it also took all of the supply that was being created during 2020, 2021, and 2022 and re-dump it back on the market back in 2023. So not only are you having the production of 2023 hitting the market, you're having the production of the last several years hit it as all of these different breeders got out. And it was here at this point that we were reaching the 50,000 available ball pythons on morph market, but it started to reverse. One of the biggest problems that was going on was the lack of liquidity, and everybody was panicking because they thought that they weren't going to be able to sell their animals. So Morph Market introduced auctions, which essentially guaranteed that if you put an animal on auction, it was going to sell. It might not sell for anywhere near what you thought that it was worth, but it would still sell, and that was one less animal that you had to care for and one less animal that you had to feed. So this alone added a large amount of liquidity, and it also helped understand what exactly were the prices of specific projects and specific morphs that other people were willing to pay, and it allowed the regular listings to adjust their prices accordingly. In addition to the auctions increasing liquidity, production was also scaled back. So there was a large segment of COVID breeders that were no longer breeding their animals, and therefore they weren't going to be producing animals in the next season. In addition, a lot of the big breeders who had scaled up production but then were left with a large amount of hatchlings that they didn't anticipate didn't pair as many animals the following year, and therefore they produced less animals. Not only did larger breeders scale back their production, some big breeders completely got out of ball pythons entirely and either left the reptile hobby or they shifted towards different species. Lastly, shed testing started really kicking off in the ball python industry, and while this resulted in situations where you didn't have to breed a posset animal in order to prove them out, which might have resulted in clutches of animals that nobody really wanted because they didn't have the genes to begin with. It also resulted in a situation where a posset animal didn't have to be a posset anymore. You could shed test it and know that it was either heterozygous for the gene that you wanted and you either held it back or you sold it for the appropriate price, or it wasn't heterozygous for that gene and therefore it could be sold at a more appropriate price, and there weren't going to be these situations where posset animals kind of sat in limbo because people weren't willing to spend too much money on them for the gamble that might not turn out in their favor. Huge shout out, by the way, to Rare Genetics Incorporated because they sponsor the channel. If you go to their website, raregeneticsinc.com, and buy any of the shed tests there, you can use the discount code Leviathan and get a 15% off your entire order. It doesn't matter if it's a single gene test or if it's 100 different full panels. It is 15% off the entire order, and as I'm saying this, there is no limit on the amount of times that you can use the discount code. So if you were used to spending, let's say $40 for a single gene shed test, if you use the discount code Leviathan on raregeneticsinc.com, it will be $34 at the time of recording this video. Back to the drawdown. Throughout all of this time, there were still people buying ball pythons. There were still new people coming in and keeping ball pythons as pets. There was still new people coming in and just starting to breed, and there was still breeders who were already established in the hobby who were upgrading their collection and they were buying into new projects. But with the reduction in production and a certain level of sustained demand, it was able to whittle away at those 50,000 ball pythons until now, where we are in the summer of 2025, and it is down almost half. This leads us to our second question, and that is this a good thing or a bad thing for the ball python hobby? And on the positive side, I think that it is good for pretty much every single breeder who is currently in the hobby right now, because there is less competition. And because there is less competition, it's easier to sell your animals. It's easier to get into shows. It's easier to get noticed in the hobby because there's not 10 million people, it seems like, fighting for the same amount of customers that was getting smaller and smaller and smaller as time went on. Also, when it comes to the buying of the animals, for the most part, prices have fairly stabilized from, let's say, 2024 until now. Huge shout out to Jessica of the Whole Back Rack because she just posted a video on her quarterly stonk report where she goes over prices of various different popular ball python morphs over time and talks about the impacts of the market. It is an amazing video and you guys definitely need to check it out. It is linked down below. That said, there's definitely some bad aspects to this drawdown, and it primarily deals with the people who have gotten out of ball pythons. One, that means that there is less total people buying ball pythons. In addition, there are some very, very prominent people in the community who have gotten out of ball pythons. So they used to be responsible for growing the hobby based off of their platform and based off of the influence that they had. But in a weird way, the best case scenario now that they are out of ball pythons is that they are just simply not growing the hobby hobby anymore. But it is also not uncommon for people who stay in reptiles but get out of ball pythons to become detractors and try to dissuade new people from getting into the ball python breeding world. Lastly, what does this mean about the future of the ball python industry? And in my opinion, I think that this means that the vast majority of the people who are still left breeding ball pythons are not doing it because they think that they're going to get rich quick. Instead, they're doing it because they love the animals, they love the projects, and they personally want to create something in this hobby. But that doesn't mean that they don't want money, and that doesn't mean that they aren't going to be super excited to sell an amazing animal that they've been working for years and years to produce. What I think is that most people are going to scale it down and look at it as side income rather than the get rich quick kind of scheme that was very prevalent during COVID. Eventually though, I do think that there will be a spark that will reignite interest in a boom sort of way that happened during COVID, even if it isn't quite to that level of mania. And I think that this could come from a wave of social media influencers that are very positive about ball pythons. I think it could come from traditional media that is very positive about ball pythons and attracts the public's attention that didn't even consider that they existed. And lastly, I think that it could result where the people who are hardcore about breeding ball pythons eventually make a brand new combo or work with a brand new gene that reignites the interest in some of the people who got out and brings them back in. And again, it can reignite a boom cycle that will probably eventually lead to another bust. Huge thanks to everybody for watching. If you guys enjoyed this video, consider hitting the subscribe button down below. We post a weekly ball python video every Wednesday at 11 a.m. In addition, we post daily on Instagram, and every Tuesday at 11 a.m. we drop a Patreon exclusive audio-only podcast where Courtney and I are talking about current events, how we structured our breeding projects, and our advice on various different topics. If you want, check out the free trial and see all of the different episodes we've already released, which has been more than a year, so there's quite a bit of content for you guys to go through. Anyways, my name's Steven with Leviathan, and we will see you next week.
Petitions count
exactly. So that's why I'm like,
I think a couple things on it. And one, I fully expect that if this does happen, like the way that we're talking about it, that there will be people who have those exact same complaints. The things on it are